Throughout the long war, the Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler have wreaked havoc across the Imperium. The 13th and most recent of them, however, may have struck the most grievous of blows to the Emperor's armies, destroying a world deemed centric to stopping the forces of chaos. It was one of, if not the most militarized world in the Imperium, guardian of one of the most stable routes in and out of the Eye of Terror, and it speaks volumes of the regiments raised there that despite the loss of their home, they continue to fight with distinction and skill. They may not have a world to go back to, and it may well be that they are on an inexorable path to extinction, but whilst a single one of them draws breath, then their home will stand. Said home was the former fortress world of Cadia, and the regiments raised from its surface are perhaps the most famous of all within the Imperium. These disciplined marksmen, trained from birth, are known collectively as the Cadian Shock Troops. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Regiments of Renown, a 40k Stories mini-series. Around the warp rift known as the Eye of Terror, there isn't much stability to be found, which makes getting in and out of the Eye at short notice rather problematic. There are ways through, of course, though they are either unstable or temporary in nature, but there was one route that was stable, permanent, and large enough to permit the passage of even battle fleets, the region of space known as the Cadian Gate, presumably named after the Cadian system that is the closest system to it. It is for this reason that the Imperium heavily fortified the Cadian Gate and thus the Cadian system, as it would be the best attack route for any major chaos invasions spilling from the Eye. Almost the entire system was designed for war, with 4 fortress worlds and a militarized hive world along with production and naval facilities, but none were more heavily geared for combat than Cadia itself. The civilization that called Cadia home was not the original human settlers, as they were wiped out by cyclonic torpedoes sometime between their discovery by the Word Bearers 40 years pre-Horus Heresy and the First Black Crusade 100 years or so later. This original civilization was made up of chaos worshippers, and it was here that Lorgar would eventually be swayed to follow the ruinous powers and meet Ingathel the Ascended before his pilgrimage into the Eye. The first defences on Cadia were established in response to the First Black Crusade, and though it wasn't the bastion it would go on to become, it would still hold firm. Following the Second Black Crusade, the cities of Cadia were completely transformed once again, as they simply weren't defensible enough in their original form. They became known as castles, elaborate and incredibly heavily defended fortress citadels guarded by elite stormtrooper units known as Kassakin, and this design would see the world through the next several millennia. Interesting though, Cadia was not a world covered by military infrastructure and choked of all life as a result. Forests, tundras and more were still present on its surface. However, the most interesting feature of Cadia was actually an unnatural phenomenon. Thousands of large devices known as pylons believed to be of Necron origin. It is believed that the pylons are the reason for the Cadian Gate's very existence, as proven throughout the expansion of the warp in the 13th Black Crusade. They seem to resonate in a manner equivalent to Geller fields, helping to keep the Imperium at bay and even capable of depowering its denizens at full power. Given its strategic importance, it is of no surprise that Cadia and the other worlds in its system have been invaded multiple times bound down the years. The moon of Prosan, for example, was invaded by the Orcs under the warboss known as Tusker the Demon Killer, though in that case the enemy was heading into the Eye of Terror rather than out of it, and so the success of the Greenskins can be partially excused. Where Cadia and the overall system always excelled was defending against incursions from out of the now second biggest warp rift in the galaxy, most notably the Black Crusades of Abaddon. Cadia itself was invaded that we know of in 3 prior crusades, the first, second and fourth, though I waited the third also had a go too. Admittedly, the 4th Crusade's assault on Cadia was pretty much just a distraction, but the point stands, and throughout all these invasions Cadia stood and Cadia held. And then the 13th Black Crusade, commonly known as the Fall of Cadia, happened. No prizes for guessing the short version of what happened there. The full story revolves massively around the pylons we mentioned earlier, both in terms of Abaddon's goals and their applications for Cadia's defence. Abaddon wished them destroyed, as this would allow the warp to leak into the material realm, but following damage to his collection on Solemnace, the Necron Lord Trajan the Infinite wished to tinker with and power them up. To the end, the Pharaon arrived on Cadia and allied with Belisarius Cawl of the Mechanicus, as well as releasing members of his own collection, including Inquisitor Greyfax, to aid in the defence. And oh, what a defence it was. Despite being isolated due to the machinations of Erebus of the Wordbearers, Cadia was able to hold, even able to power back up the planetary shields to prevent destruction by a Blackstone fortress captured in the Gothic War, also known as the 12th Black Crusade. Said fortress was then destroyed through the efforts of the Phalanx, just as the ground invasion under the demon prince Urcanthos was turned back by Trajan's machinations and the unforeseen appearance of none other than Saint Celestine. Eventually, Cawl and Trajan were able to modify the pylons during the next landing, launched personally by Abaddon rather than by one of his endless lieutenants. This, unfortunately, was a double-edged sword. The warp receded and depowered the demonic forces along with Psychers on both sides, but it had the side effect of also weakening Celestine and the Legion of the Damned who had seemingly arrived with the Phalanx. If ever there was evidence that these individuals were some sort of warp entities, this is it. This meant that the traitors under Abaddon had the advantage due to being Space Marines and still having a decent amount of numbers. And yet the Black Legion retreated all the same. The depowered Celestine was able to grievously wound Abaddon whilst he was distracted, forcing the War Master of Chaos to return to the vengeful spirit. In fact, at this point the Black Legion withdrew entirely from Cadia, but the Despoiler had one last spiteful card to play. The destroyed Blackstone fortress was directed to crash into Cadia, all whilst the aptly named Planet Killer fired its Armageddon gun and began to break the planet apart. The pylons were damaged and generally no longer able to keep the warp in check, and a mass evacuation was ordered as Cadia was broken and swallowed up by the warp. And so Cadia fell, never to rise again. But despite this, Cadia stands. Though its original population pre-fall of 850 million is only around 3 million today, whilst a single Cadian draws breath, the planet yet lives. The majority of these survivors are the remnants of the Cadian Shock Troops, for though much of their strength was called back to defend their home, they weren't all there, and some will have escaped as well. The Cadian Shock Troops are thought to be amongst the best fighters in humanity's armies aside from the legendary Space Marines, and you don't earn that reputation that widely unless you can back it up. Recruitment into the Shock Troops was simple. If you were Cadian, you enlisted, and the birth rate matched the recruitment rate as a result. This may be typical for any fortress world, which are created only in times of need and gear their entire populace toward war. Military training came before basic education. Many young Cadians could take a lasgun apart or fire it before being able to write. After all, according to that famous quote, any Cadian unable to field strip a lasgun by the age of 8 was born on the wrong planet. These trainees were the White Shields, and they were trained relentlessly, with discipline and marksmanship being the core focuses, along with an emphasis on teamwork and cooperation. Cadia also operated something of a meritocratic military hierarchy. If you showed promise and talent for combat or command, you were inducted to train as part of the Caciquian or the Officer Corps, though the nobles of the planet were almost always officers, so it wasn't entirely on merit. These two groups were trained even harder, with the officers eschewing the usual teaching in a classroom and getting their experience stuck in on the front line, and being part of either group was a mark of respect, especially the Caciquian. Once training was completed, the Cadian regiments were usually organised as combined arms forces of 2 to 30 companies, though the average was definitely a fair bit above 10. These companies were usually a single type, infantry, artillery and such, though armoured support such as sentinels could be scattered about. These are typical, but not absolute, as the Cadian command structure dictated flexibility in times of war. Pure armour or recon regiments exist, sizes of units or companies can vary, and the support elements assigned to the regiments can vary a fair amount too. As far as equipment goes, the green flak armour typical of shock troops serves as camouflage in the Cadian wilderness, and due to the industry of Cadia and its system, it was some of the finest available. Same goes for the lasguns, renowned for robustness and thus ideal for a planet at near constant war. Even the basic guardsmen and women had enough equipment to survive in airless combat zones for a short time, as well as withstand toxic weaponry, well, within reason. Their preferred support weapon comes in the form of the grenade launcher, a versatile weapon due to its multiple ammunition types over a reasonable range, whilst the autocannon is the heavy weapon of choice, a mix of high damage, range, and rate of fire. Typical armoured units would include the classic Leman Russ and its siege variant, the Demolisher, with a broad range of super heavy and artillery vehicles completing the set. Though they are renowned for their marksmanship, there are no known theatres of war preferred by Cadian regiments. Sure, they may train in the wilderness of Cadia as White Shields, but they seem capable of coping in any climate, from the scorching heat of Armageddon to the freezing cold of Fenris, and in any terrain from the deserts of Talon to the hives typical across the Imperium. Perhaps this is no surprise, as the amount of training the Cadians receive means it will almost certainly include drills for inhospitable war zones or for strategies in different environments. But it still says a lot about the shock troops that they can always handle whatever the galaxy throws at them. Unsurprisingly, there are a large number of battles the Cadian shock troops have fought in down the millennia aside from the many Black Crusades, so let us have a look at some of those and the regiments involved in them. The first is the Vogan campaign, a city battle as part of the wider Kai'Zan uprising. The planetary defence force had partially become corrupted, especially with the aid of a known conman who had been drawn to the system, and they, along with allies in the form of demons, converted cultists and around 100 Night Lords Chaos Astartes were able to oust the planetary governor and take Vogan, capital of Kai'Zan. The only Imperial forces capable of holding out were the 122nd Cadian Regiment stationed on World, along with the Adeptus Arbites, though both contingents found themselves besieged and repeatedly assaulted by the traitors. Surprisingly quickly, however, the Imperium had a relief force ready, and though the Imperial Fists were vitally important for handling the Night Lords, the bulk of the fighting was handled by the forces of Cadia, the 7th and 9th Infantry and the 3rd Heavy Tank Regiment alongside the 122nd. It took around 4 months, the majority of which was spent admittedly on the final siege, but eventually Vogan was retaken and Kai'Zan returned to Imperial hands. Another, older engagement came on the moon of Mihawk Secundus, where the 15th and 22nd Regiments squared off with the invading Alpha Legion. Even though the former 20th Legion are renowned for their planning and subtlety, the Battle of Mihawk Secundus was much more of a full-on frontal assault, as the only passable area was completely fortified by the Cadians. It was the 22nd who fought the majority of the battle for several weeks until once again reinforcements arrived. However, this time these reinforcements from a number of worlds were completely unnecessary. Somehow the Alpha Legion had been defeated, though at great cost to the defenders. The 22nd were actually granted retirement at this point, freedom from service in an incredibly rare occurrence, usually only granted to veterans. Pretty much the only way you leave the guard is in a box. 3 armoured Cadian regiments, the 1651st to 1653rd, were involved against the Red War, supposedly led by war boss Gruk Face Ripper. Though the majority of the fighting force of the Imperial defence was knightly houses, the Cadian commander ably led the defence, blunting the Greenskin offensive even when Gruk took to the field. This commander, a Castellan Stein and thus a fortress commander by his title, realised that killing the head of the War, like so often happens, would throw the Orcs into disarray. It took the efforts of a Fleablade Knight, but it apparently worked, and the Red War was broken for a time until it was revealed that a big mech named Mogrok was able to hold a chunk of the Orcs together. Grok also did survive, but he didn't show up again for the duration. Sadly for the Cadians and the other defenders of Alaric Prime, the world they were on, fate wasn't going to let them win for long. Even whilst keeping Mogrok's reduced war at bay, they were wiped out by a comet seemingly made to crash into the mountain they were fighting on by the Orcs. Presumably deliberately, but with Orcs, you never know. These battles all show the skill and valour of the Cadian shock troops, particularly in defensive engagements, and there are many more examples of this in Imperial records, I am sure. But they're only human. They can't have it all their own way. I mean, their homeworld got blown up. Of course they don't. The Eldari seem to be something of an Achilles heel, if they have one, for the Cadians, which is ironic given the Inari would save the survivors of Cadia from the Black Legion after the planet was lost. There are actually several examples for this. We mentioned Gnosis when we discussed the Valhallan Ice Warriors, but Cadians were there as well when they were wiped out by the forces of Saim Han. The Kyobin raid of the Drakari Cabal of the Black Heart caused massive damage to the defences of the fortress world of the same name, leaving the wider sector vulnerable, though accidentally, to the traitorous Crimson Slaughter. and the Craftworlders and Harlequins managed to launch a successful raid on the world of Batalis III to find the armour of the Phoenix Lord Irilith, though the Corsair pirates accompanying them also took masses of slaves, which will have been a bitter sting in the tail for the Cadians and the other defenders. Ironically, even beating the Eldari doesn't always help. A heavy defeat at Cadian hands inspired the Drukhari to raid and utterly obliterate the planet of Greystar. However, there is one campaign against the Eldari of particular renown, the Delarax campaign, pitting Cadia against Simhan once again. This battle was very armour-centric, with masses of tanks and even titans lost on both sides. The Eldari arrived during fierce storms in one of Delarax's deserts, causing massive damage and almost driving the reinforcing Cadian regiments off their landing site before they could secure a beachhead. Eventually, titans were unleashed by both forces, and both would claim victory in separate engagements. The war became focused on a strange tower in the desert at the Eye of the Storm, with the Cadians trying to destroy the Eldari shield generators in a battle known as Phantom Fall. It gets its name for the destruction of the last Phantom Titan on Delarax, but even with this success, the Cadians were driven off, thanks in part to the intervention of the Phoenix Lord Fugan. This forced a battle inside the shields, but this time the Guard were able to prevail, destroying a Warlock Titan and then being able to destroy that aforementioned tower via the use of a Death Strike missile. Admittedly, it wasn't a total victory, as the Eldari disappeared before the dust had settled rather than being wiped out with the storm having abated. Cadians have also been involved in many of the larger Imperial campaigns down the years too, against a variety of other foes. Pandarax, Agralan, Armageddon and Medusa 5 are some of the most famous, to name but a few, and simply for the sake of time, I can only suggest you research them for yourself if you want to see what the Shock Troopers can do. The heroes of Cadia are genuinely innumerable, since we're having to consider 10,000 years worth of planetary populace with a 100% recruitment rate. However, in this modern era, their most famous general is the overall commander of their forces, Lord Castellan Osaka Creed. Found as a boy by the Cadian 8th Regiment, the young Creed shone in his training in the White Shield and became fast friends with a fellow White Shield named Jaren Kell. The two rose meteorically fast through the 8th, almost side by side. By the close of their first campaign, an unknown engagement called the Black Crusade, Creed was a captain with Kell as his colour sergeant. Creed was the silent type and Kell loud and brash, so they complemented each other perfectly, but under the quiet exterior, Creed was one of the brightest minds, not only on Cadia, but in the Imperium at large. An incredible strategist and a tactical genius, Creed was also renowned for leading from the front and playing just loose enough with the rules whilst maintaining discipline and not annoying the commissariat too much. He would become one of the most renowned generals in the Cadian command structure, but it was in the prelude to the 13th Black Crusade that he would truly become a legend and achieve the rank he holds today. With the threat of chaos looming, masses of shock troops were summoned back to Cadia to aid in its defence, with the muster near Tactica Tyrock at a place called the Tyrock Fields. However, one of the mustering regiments from off-world, the Volskani Cataphracts, revealed themselves as traitors and began to rout the caught-out defenders. The planetary governor's command tank was destroyed, and all the while Nurgle was corrupting the successor, causing a forced quarantine on Casa Vazan. But Creed was able to restore a sense of order despite the loss of much of Cadia's command structure. It was costly, but the traitorous Volskani were wiped out, and Creed was appointed Lord Castellan of Cadia, an emergency rank giving overall command of Cadia's military. This meant that it was Creed in charge of the defence against Abaddon, working with Khorne and others in the 13th Black Crusade to buy time for the pylons to be activated. Kell was slain by Abaddon to allow Creed to escape from the Bringers of Despair, the traitorous equivalent of the old Justarian Terminator elite from the Lunar Wolves Legion. Creed swore revenge, and to some extent, he actually got it. After Celestine was depowered by the activation of the pylons, Creed intervened in her duel with Abaddon to save the living saint. It would cost him his arm to do so, but he was able to distract the Warmaster long enough for Celestine to deal that grievous injury and force Abaddon to retreat. The wounded Creed and the Cadian 8th, known since Creed's rise as the Lord Castellan's own, stayed behind even as Cadia broke apart to cover the evacuation. One might assume that Creed would finally die here, but he was rescued by a metal giant in a scaled cloak, telling him his time was not yet through. The logical assumption is that this was treason, but as Creed and the Giants have not been referenced since, we cannot be sure. A confirmed survivor of the fall of Cadia is their greatest tank ace, Knight Commander Pask. Some do say he died there, but most say he wasn't there at all. First rising to prominence on the planet Cyrus, Pask was serving as part of the crew of a Leman Russ when its commander was killed when the turret he was in was crushed by an Orc death roller. Pask took command of the tank and turned it around, firing the las cannons with incredible precision and making the tank that killed his commander flip over on the offending death roller, then racking up another 14 engine kills before the battle's end. When the tank Hand of Steel was repaired, Pask was given command of it, and it served with distinction until it was destroyed by Eldari fire prisms on a world called Hator's Hole. Despite being offered a Baneblade to command in its stead, Pask declined and took a new Leman Russ from the 432nd Regiment he'd been serving with, staying with them in a show of solidarity and renaming the tank Hand of Steel. He has done this with every time he has lost the tank he was commanding, and throughout his career he has come to know and understand, and I assume lose, every variant of the ubiquitous tank. He was in command for the battle on Delarax we discussed earlier, and he also oversaw the battle with the Adamant Fury Traitor Titan Legion, the largest tank battle in human history since the Battle of Talon in the Horus Heresy. Perhaps it was even larger. We believe he was not involved in the defence of Cadia, as in its aftermath he has been recruiting heavily to replenish numbers after fighting at Agralan. This is pretty common practice for Cadians, but Pask's Steel Tithe only selects the best off-world crews to join his 432nd, to the point that it has become something of a competition to get requisitioned by the Knight Commander, and any who are selected will serve with the same distinction and skill as any native Cadian. One of the lower ranked heroes of Cadia is a sergeant by the name of Lucas Baston. Though as a member of Cadian nobility, he had declined a position of command in order to start at the bottom and work his way up. His memory is perfect, and he has a knack for strategy, making him a very useful asset. Unfortunately, his memory is his curse as well. He remembers every man and woman lost under his command, as well as every horror he has had to see. A notable example came on the Forge World Agrippina, where Baston and his veteran squad were able to rescue the planetary governor from assumedly Nurgle's plagues, with Baston earning even more praise for saving a wounded trooper of his squad in a no-man-left-behind type of move. Unfortunately, that trooper now haunts Baston's dreams, as he exhibited signs of corruption on the way home, and thus the sergeant was forced to execute him. His fate is unknown, as we do not know if he was on Cadia as it broke, but perhaps death will be a release from his nightmares when it finally comes. Finally, I wish to quickly mention one other individual, Lieutenant Mira of the 203rd Cadian, who rose to prominence on the Forge World of Graia. Her regiment was first to arrive in response to a massive Orc invasion, but much of the command staff was killed, leaving her as the overall Imperial commander. She liaised with the Ultramarines force that were next to arrive, setting up a rally point for future reinforcements and aiding the Space Marines and their Inquisitor allies in the mission. Even as the force of Chaos began to invade Graia, Mira and the 203rd refused to give up, holding their main bastion long enough for the war boss to be slain and the larger Liberation fleet to arrive. Ultimately, the Imperials were victorious thanks in no small part to the Adeptus Astartes, and Mira showed that Cadian grit one more time, having the nerve to attempt to convince the Ultramarines commander to defy the Inquisition. Her fate post-Graia is unknown, but if she's still around today, I don't doubt she's been given quite a vaunted posting for both her ability as a commander and as a soldier. So end the tales of the Cadian Shock Troops. The most known of the regiments of renown, the forces of Cadia are proud, disciplined and tough, to the point that their planet broke before chaos, before they did. Even at this potential time of ending for them, they continue to fight for the Imperium without fail, defending its worlds and destroying its foes. Whatever the future holds, the Cadian Shock Troops will live long in the memory and be recorded in history as some of the greatest heroes of the Astra Militarum. Now then, we may be near to the Eye of Terror, but I have no intention of diving in and exploring all the traitor warbands buried within. Between lack of knowledge and great personal risk, it's an endeavour not worth undertaking at this time. However, there are those Space Marines who draw the line between loyal and traitor, those not accepted by the Imperium but not necessarily servants of the ruinous powers, and it is them that we will explore next time. Thank you all for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.